Hello and welcome to INET's Year in Review, when we take a look back at the top news stories of 2014. From terrorism in the Middle East to missing Malaysian jetliners, from an assault on freedom of the press itself to the end of an era in broadcasting. 2014 was a year to remember. Hello and welcome. We're starting off our Year in Review coverage with an egregious assault on freedom of the press in Egypt. On December 29, 2013, three Al Jazeera journalists, Peter Gresta, Bahar Mohammed, and Mohammed Fahmy, were arrested on trumped-up charges of falsifying news. The trio was then imprisoned for months without trial before they were subjected to a sham trial in which no real evidence was presented. Despite international condemnation, the journalists remain in prison, and Al Jazeera has been banned from operating in Egypt. In February, the world's worst recorded Ebola epidemic started in Western Africa. The Ebola outbreak began in Guinea and rapidly spread to neighboring countries. NGOs in the region heavily criticized the world's lack of a response to the burgeoning crisis. In October, a man traveling from Africa was admitted to a Dallas, Texas hospital and diagnosed with the Ebola virus. He then went on to infect several healthcare workers in the United States, the first time the Ebola virus had ever been contracted inside the US. More recently, the crisis has come under some semblance of control, with the epidemic declared over in Nigeria and other African countries. However, 6,700 people are thought to have been killed by the Ebola virus. In 2014, Ukraine's political crisis worsened and sucked in a large chunk of Eastern Europe, along with several countries around the world. On February 22nd, the Ukrainian parliament voted to oust former President Viktor Yanukovych. Yanukovych had already fled the country. In response to the president's removal, pro-Russian demonstrators took to the streets in eastern Ukraine and on the peninsula of Crimea. Soon after, unidentified commandos began pouring into Crimea and taking control of government and military buildings. After that, a highly contested referendum was held in Crimea in which a majority of voters voted to join Russia rather than staying with Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin confirmed the annexation of Crimea on March 21st. Emboldened by the annexation of Crimea, pro-Russian rebels in eastern Ukraine took up arms against the government, but this time the government in Kiev would fight back. Since then, there has been an ongoing civil war in East Ukraine between pro-Russian rebels and the Ukrainian military. Russia is widely believed to be providing weapons, supplies, and even personnel to the rebels. On July 17th, a surface-to-air missile fired from the rebel-controlled area in eastern Ukraine struck Malaysia Airlines flight MH17, a passenger aircraft, killing all 283 passengers and 15 crew on board. It is widely believed that the missile was fired by pro-Russian rebels in eastern Ukraine, the same rebels that are being armed by Russia, further exacerbating tensions between Russia and the West. In June, the terrorist group known as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL, launched a military offensive with the intention of taking control of the country's capital, Baghdad. The group made shocking progress when they swept across northern Iraq, taking control of several major towns and cities. Eventually, the Iraqi army would hold them back before they took control of the capital. The subhuman barbarians have shocked the world with brutal tactics, including the beheading of journalists and foreign aid workers, genocide being committed against religious minorities, and ruling the territories they control with barbaric tactics not accepted since the Middle Ages. The fight against the barbarians has sparked some unusual allies, with the United States, Iran, and Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria all working to destroy the terrorist group. ISIL was born out of Syria's civil war, which, by the way, is still going on. That civil war started back in 2011 with anti-government protests. The Syrian regime has widely been accused of committing war crimes, including the use of chemical weapons against its own people. It is estimated the conflict has led to the deaths of more than 200,000 people and the creation of 3 million refugees. Staying with news in the Middle East now, and big surprise, yet another war broke out between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. This latest fight broke out over tensions after 3 Palestinian and 1 Israeli teen were killed. The fighting started after Israel began launching airstrikes into the Gaza Strip in response to Hamas rocket fire fired towards Israel. The airstrikes are followed by a ground invasion just over a week later. As with most Palestinian-Israeli conflicts, the vast majority of the casualties were on the Palestinian side, and many of them were civilians. Fighting ended on August 26th with little or nothing accomplished. Towards the end of 2013, Thai citizens took to the streets demonstrating against their president, Yingluck Shinawatra. Protests began in October 2013 and continued right through into 2014. In January, in response to the protests, the government declared a state of emergency, granting them sweeping powers. On May 7th, Yingluck and 9 ministers were removed from power and control of the country handed over to a caretaker government. Finally, on May 20th, the military declared martial law and took control of the country. The situation on the ground in Thailand has remained relatively calm since the coup, but more recently, protests have begun flaring up. Demonstrators took to the streets of Mexico in November, angry over perceived government inaction in the case of 43 missing college students, presumed murdered by the drug cartels. The students were believed to have been arrested by police and then handed over to the cartels by corrupt police officers. Protesters are calling for the resignation of the Mexican president, Enrique Peña Nieto. In Sydney, Australia, a hostage crisis left 3 people dead on Tuesday, December 16th. Around 10 a.m. Eastern Australian Daylight Time the previous day, an Iranian refugee known to police stormed a cafe, taking 17 people hostage. The resulting standoff with police lasted 16 long hours before police finally stormed the building. 2 people and the hostage taker were killed in the incident. Frustration in the United States over police racial profiling of African American youths bubbled over when demonstrators took to the streets in major cities across the U.S. The protests started after 2 separate grand juries decided not to indict police officers who killed unarmed African American males in unrelated incidents. The first took place in New York when Eric Garner died from suffocation after being held in an illegal chokehold by a white police officer. The second taking place on August 9th in Ferguson, Missouri, when teenager Michael Brown was shot and killed by police officer Darren Wilson. Tensions escalated when 2 New York City police officers were murdered in a retaliatory attack, and most recently another African American teen was shot and killed in Berkeley, Missouri on December 23rd after he allegedly pulled a gun on officers. In May, the Nigerian terrorist group Boko Haram abducted 279 schoolgirls at a boarding school in northern Nigeria. The abduction sparked outrage around the world. In July, some of the girls escaped. However, the vast majority of them, that's more than 200, are still missing. The Nigerian military has been criticized heavily by their lackluster response to the incident. Protesters took to the streets of Hong Kong in September when Chinese authorities declined to let citizens directly elect the city's next leader, instead opting to give voters a screened list of candidates. Protesters, outraged by this assault on the city's democracy, took to the streets in demonstration. Authorities allowed the protests to continue for a time, but have recently forcibly dismantled the encampments. Protesters say they will be back. As if having one plane shot down wasn't bad enough, 2014 got even worse for Malaysian Airlines after flight MH370 vanished over the Gulf of Thailand in March. The flight was supposed to be traveling from the Malaysian capital Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. However, satellite data revealed that the flight had instead turned south into the Indian Ocean. Despite extensive searching, neither the plane nor indeed any wreckage from the plane was ever recovered. Scotland held an historic referendum in September in which voters were asked if they wanted to break their ties with the United Kingdom and become an independent nation. The vote was widely expected to go overwhelmingly in favor of staying with the Union, right up until the last weeks of the campaign when polls revealed that the vote was nearly 50-50 split. In the end, Scotland did decide to vote to stay with the UK, although just barely. British Prime Minister David Cameron has promised Scotland new powers in response to the referendum. On April 16th, a passenger ferry sank off the coast of South Korea with 476 people on board. The story made headlines around the world after it was revealed that the captain and several crew members asked passengers to stay in their cabins while they escaped on lifeboats, likely leading to the deaths of many more passengers than would otherwise have occurred. 295 people have been confirmed dead in the incident, and the captain of the ferry, along with several crew members, have been charged with murder. And the United States released a long-anticipated Senate report on torture used on detainees in response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Not surprisingly, it was revealed that the CIA officers did torture prisoners using waterboarding, extreme sleep deprivation, and other tactics. The worst news, that CIA officials didn't even gain much valuable intelligence from the interrogations. Sports news now. The 2014 Winter Olympics were held in Sochi, Russia. As with most Olympic Games in recent memory, the sport aspect was overshadowed by political and social events. In this case, demonstrations against gay and lesbian discrimination laws passed by the Russian Federation and Russia's involvement in the ongoing political situation in Ukraine grabbing the world's attention. The Olympic Games, not the only major sporting event to take place this year. The 2014 FIFA World Cup was held in Brazil over the month of June. The lead up to the tournament was fraught with tension as construction delays kept pushing the opening of the venues further back. Protesters also took to the streets en masse before and during the World Cup to demonstrate against the deplorable social conditions and infrastructure for average Brazilian citizens. And finally, Paralympic athlete Oscar Pistorius was convicted of culpable homicide by a South African court. Pistorius had fatally shot his girlfriend Riva Steenkamp back in 2013. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in prison. Technology news now. In 2014 was a year for hackers and for security vulnerabilities. The most widespread one was a bug in the popular encryption protocol OpenSSL, which powers the vast majority of servers on the internet. The bug, dubbed Heartbleed, allowed an attacker to request up to 64 kilobytes of arbitrary data in the server's memory, data which could include passwords and even encryption keys. The bug was quickly patched in the 1.01G release of OpenSSL, but not before it was used to compromise several systems in the wild, including the Canadian Revenue Agency. Sony made headlines in November when thousands of private documents were leaked to file-sharing websites after the company's network was hacked. The attackers have been linked to the regime of North Korea, angry about a movie parodying the reclusive state commissioned by Sony. Among the data leaked were several unreleased movies, private emails, and private employee information, such as social security numbers. Sony would initially cancel a movie's release after the attackers threatened moviegoers with a 9/11-style attack, but backpedaled when they received a heavy dose of criticism from actors, staff, and even the U.S. president. The interview was released online and at select theaters on Christmas Day. Another major security vulnerability discovered in Microsoft's popular Internet Explorer web browser, the bug, which affects every single version of the web browser, allowed an attacker to execute arbitrary code remotely on a victim's computer. Microsoft quickly patched the bug for all current versions of the Windows operating system, including the now end-of-life Windows XP. Several celebrities learned firsthand the perils of storing sensitive data on so-called cloud servers when nude photos of popular actresses were leaked to the internet. In a statement, Apple Computers said that their iCloud system as a whole was not compromised and that the leak was the result of targeted attacks on specific accounts. Nevertheless, it is a reminder to anyone who uses cloud storage to enable two-factor authentication and use strong passwords. Microsoft's popular Windows XP operating system reached end of life April 8, 2014, more than a decade after it was originally released to consumers. The discontinuation of support is notable because Windows XP was so popular, and it was estimated that in January of 2014 had an 11% market share. The discontinuation of support led to a rush on new PCs, and the operating system's market share has dropped to an estimated 7%. Popular Bitcoin exchange Mt. Gox shut down in 2014. The exchange shut its doors in February after announcing that more than 850,000 Bitcoins had gone missing. The incident was a huge blow to the popular cryptocurrency, which has been losing its dollar value in recent months. The popular Java-based computer game Minecraft was sold to Microsoft for more than $2 billion in 2014. The game, which was released back in 2009, has proven to be extremely popular with consumers. At this time, it is unclear what the future of Minecraft will be in the hands of Microsoft. Apple made headlines in 2014 when they announced their first smartwatch in September. The watch, which has yet to be released, will integrate tightly with the iOS and Apple ecosystems. And history was made when the European Space Agency successfully landed a probe on a comet. The landing was the result of a 10-year-long mission. Unfortunately, things not going entirely according to plan, with the probe landing in an area with less sunlight than anticipated, leading to the batteries becoming depleted. Nevertheless, valuable scientific data was obtained during the short mission. And now it's time for INET's Media Moments 2014 edition. The stories that either received way too much media coverage or are about the media themselves. And we begin with a seemingly endless stream of rape allegations leveled against comedian and actor Bill Cosby. The allegations, most of them dating back decades, were thrust into the mainstream thanks to a November Washington Post article. Cosby has yet to be formally charged with a crime and has refused to respond to the allegations. On August 11, 2014, the world was shocked to learn of the death of actor and comedian Robin Williams. Williams, who has struggled with depression throughout his life, committed suicide by hanging. Williams, who will be dearly missed by his family and the public alike, was 63 years old. Political satirist and comedian Stephen Colbert hosted his last episode of his popular Comedy Central program, The Colbert Report, on December 18th. The show, which has proven to be extremely popular among young viewers, has been on the air for 9 years. Colbert will take over as host of The Late Show from David Letterman in 2015. And finally, out of the conflict in Ukraine, a new news channel was born. English language and Kiev-based Ukraine Today launched on August 14th. The channel is owned and operated by the 1+1 Media Group, and its main goal is to transmit English language news to a worldwide audience with a pro-government slant. And those were all the stories that grabbed our attention in 2014. From all of us at INET, thank you for watching, and don't forget to tune in again in 2015.